Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the latest PHA conversation. I'm joined today by the wonderful Patrick Holford, who has some very, very interesting information to share. When I first heard about it, I was quite blown away, actually, and that's genuine. I was very excited by what I was hearing. So what I'm going to do in a moment is just run a bunch of questions past Paul Patrick. He'll kindly go into depth on those, I'm sure. And then, as I've mentioned, we will have a Q&A at the end, but I'll ask everyone to stay on mute. So welcome, Patrick. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's wonderful.
My pleasure. I love the People's Health Alliance.
Fabulous. What I'd like to do, just to start off with, is some people may not have come across it. If you could just kind of give us a brief overview of the Food for the Brain Foundation, that would be a great starting spot.
We started in 2006. I would like to tell you a little pre-story to that because I'm originally a psychologist and I focused in two areas. One was schizophrenia and the other was intelligence. And actually at the first degree, they got a BSc, experimental psychology, all about science, big into randomized placebo-controlled trials. And I found one, well, actually more than one, that had given a megadose of a B vitamin, B3, niacin, versus placebo to schizophrenics and got remarkable results. And it was by the head of psychiatric research in Canada at the time, Dr. Holford. I jumped on a plane, went to visit him and said, how many people have you treated with this novel mega vitamin approach? And he said, about 3,000. And I said, what's your success rate? He said, 85% cure. And I said, you're going to need to define cure because I've never seen a cured schizophrenic. And he said, free of symptoms, able to socialize with family and friends, paying income tax. So I then said, I'd like to meet some of these, cured schizophrenics, which I did, and they were just great. And then I said, I have one last question, which I'd like to be your student. And it was really, I mean, this is some years back in the early 80s. But it was really he who said, you have to change the face of nutrition and mental health. So when I left, I started in the 1980s, the profession of nutritional therapy by founding the Institute for Optimum Nutrition, which is now a degree accredited training with a man we might touch on at some point, Dr. Linus Pauling. He had 2 Nobel Prizes and 48 PhDs. He was our patron. And we had another patron called Professor Derek Bryce Smith, who was the man who got lead out of petrol. And that was my first campaign working with him. And then I left ION, Institute for Optimum Nutrition, in 1998, and then started to focus purely on mental health and nutrition. So we started the Food for the Brain Foundation. And actually, it started at the Institute of Psychiatry. We'd have these brainstorms. So I would invite speakers along and we'd explore different topics, and there was such a lot of interest. We thought we need to have a charity that focuses on nutrition and mental health because it's massively ignored. And that's what we've been doing since then. I think, as you know, we're focused quite a lot on Alzheimer's right now, and we've tested over 400,000 people on our cognitive function test, which I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Wonderful. Going to go in with one of the most, I think, one of the most important questions that will be on the tip of the tongue of many practitioners here. Is Alzheimer's preventable? And how much of this is in the genes?
Well, it definitely is. I think we should really conceive of Alzheimer's like, diabetes, heart disease, most cancer as well, but certainly the hormone-related cancers, obesity, arthritis, it's all part of this sort of breakdown. We call it metabolic syndrome, but it's not just that, but it's part of a degeneration which is driven by diet and lifestyle. Absolutely. In the case of Alzheimer's, there are 2 kinds of genes. There are those that cause disease, causative genes, and there are 3 called APP, presenilin 1 and 2, which cause Alzheimer's. So in other words, if you have these genes, you're going to get early stage Alzheimer's in your 50s or 60s. If one of your parents has that gene, you've got a 50-50 chance. Now that is less than 1%, possibly 0.5%. So we can say categorically that less than 1 in 100 cases of Alzheimer's is caused by genes. Then there are genes which can sort of predispose you towards something. I mean, a simple example, the BRCA gene, BRCA, BRCA, breast cancer gene, 50% of people who have it get breast cancer, 50% don't. So it's not, a direct cause. And all genes exert their effect through biology, which means you can change things. So if you change your circumstances, you can change things. So the conservative figure is that half of the known risk for Alzheimer's are things that we can modify, diet, nutrient intake, lifestyle, and so on. But it may be 80%. I think it probably is, that at least 80%, I think we'll find, is actually things that we can prevent. So the important point to know is that Alzheimer's primarily is not a genetic disease, number one. Number two, it is not the natural consequence of the aging process. So for sure, the older you are, the greater is your risk, but there is absolutely no reason to lose your mind at any age, in your 80s, 90s, 100, whatever. So there are sort of many examples of that. So it's not a natural part of the aging process. It is an actual disease, because I should say here that dementia, when you start to lose your cognitive function, which you test on a cognitive function test, which is what we're doing every day. I mean, yesterday, over 100 people did that test on our website. When you start to lose your cognitive function significantly, you're first diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, or MCI. Then if it's worse, with dementia. But to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's, you also have to have a brain scan of the central region of the brain. It's called the medial temporal lobe. It's where the hippocampus is. So you cannot be diagnosed with Alzheimer's without a scan. And about 2/3 of dementia is Alzheimer's. So what I'm saying here is Alzheimer's is a very specific disease, in the same way that diabetes is a disease to do with insulin. Alzheimer's is a disease of the central part of the brain. You do not need to get that disease. So Alzheimer's is largely preventable.
Fantastic. And I think we'll come more on to a bit later, sort of the test online, and get some details on that. But first off, what are the three biggest drivers of dementia, would you suggest?
Well, it's when looking at a risk, I mean, let me say there are about 30 known factors right now. So we'll talk about B vitamins in just a minute. They're very important. We'll talk about omega-3 fats, vitamin D also. Blood sugar. So, high sugar diet, high carbs, these are a major. Lack of antioxidants or polyphenols. These are fruits and vegetables and spices and so on. A lack of an active lifestyle. So exercise, anything that, activates, learning, socializing. For example, we know that hearing loss increases your risk. We know that cataracts increases your risk. But if you get a hearing aid, it reduces your risk. If you get cataract surgery, it reduces your risk. So there's all that, there's sort of stimulation. We've got some very interesting research these days on ketones. Those are made from fats and how that works. So a number of risk factors. But when we say what are the main three, the question is, for example, smoking is a risk factor, but actually in this 60+ population, only 8% of people smoke. So, if you put all your money on preventing smoking, you would protect 8%. On the other hand, I'll give you an example of this. What we know is that as people get older, their ability to absorb vitamin B12 becomes less. And you know this because a substance, it's actually a toxic amino acid called homocysteine, rises in the blood. And high homocysteine above 11 micromole per liter is present in about half of people over 65. And is lowered very, very easily by B vitamins. So if we look at these two examples, if you tackle smoking, which is a risk factor, at the most you can help 8% of people. Is it easy to change? Moderately, but there are a lot of people who really struggle to stop smoking. On the other hand, if you tackle raised homocysteine, which is very easy to test, and you give people B vitamin supplements, which you actually have to do, because there is simply, if you're not absorbing B12 well, you cannot do it by eating a bit of meat, fish, egg, milk, because B12 is only in animal produce. There's none in a vegan diet, for example. So is it easy to change a high homocysteine? Yes, very easy. You just take a B vitamin supplements, maybe 10p a day. So if you think of how many people have it, how easy is it to change, and how strong is the evidence that changing it actually works? Number one is lowering homocysteine with B vitamins. Number two is increasing omega-3, either increasing seafood or, again, supplementing omega-3. There is a vegan version of omega-3 DHA, which is the important one. And number three is controlling your sugar. Because we see even in teenagers who have metabolic syndrome, which is the change in metabolism that occurs when you eat too many ultra-processed foods, sugar, and so on. Even in teenagers, we're seeing the same shrinkage in that central area of the brain, the same kind of loss of cognitive functions that we see in Alzheimer's. So I'd say those are the three sort of, easy win, hard targets. Yeah.
Wow, thank you. I've written all that down as well, so I can look at that for myself. Are there any preventative drugs or similar in the pipeline at all? Is there anything else in that respect?
Well, if you read the newspapers, you would think yes. Because the focus in the brain, you get a buildup of amyloid protein or amyloid plaque. It actually happens in the synapses where neurons meet. And you also get what they call neurofibrillary tangles. So these are tangles of nerve fibers. So in the same way that in arthritis, you get, bone spurs, and in tooth decay, you get, calculus on the teeth. And in the same way that in heart disease, in the atheromas, the blockages in arteries, you get increased cholesterol. It's very high in the atheromas. And there's a whole reason for that. And it's not really to do with eating eggs and getting cholesterol. So these things are there. And the drugs that are really being touted, really the commitment to these drugs now has become massive, are actually injections of antibodies that attack amyloid protein. And these drugs do work in the sense that they do lower amyloid protein levels. Do they actually have a clinical effect? Combined, the answer is no. In other words, they do not have a significantly clinically meaningful improvement. And what I mean by that is that there are basically two ways two sort of common yardsticks of effect. One is called the clinical dementia rating. And it's a questionnaire. It's like an 18-point, questionnaire, and it's answered by the sufferer's carer or partner, as well as the interviewer, a medic. So it's sort of subjective, And the reason I say that is that there's a fair amount of thought that in these trials there's a bit of cheating going on. Because if, for example, your husband got dementia and he got accepted into a trial, and it's meant to be placebo controlled. So in other words, and there are monthly injections. So some get a neutral injection and some get an injection of this drug. And I should point out here that over a third of people in these trials of anti-amyloids have had either brain bleeding or brain swelling. In the last two trials, there were 5 deaths. The number of people reporting an adverse effect, in other words, noting one, is 89%. So it's terribly questionable whether you can keep the double blindness, right? So anyway, so here we are in such a trial, and it's your partner, and your wish is massively that they improve, and then you're asked if you think they could be functioning a little better, and if you go from bad to not quite so bad, you've just lessened the effect by ½ point. And what's actually happened, if you sum all the scores together, is these drugs have achieved about a ½ point shift on an 18-point scale. And most clinicians would say the partner wouldn't notice it, the sufferer wouldn't notice it, the doctor wouldn't notice it. But they are statistically significant, at least in this last trial of donanemab, the recent drug. Then the other way you probably want to look at it is brain shrinkage. what happens to brain shrinkage? Because basically Alzheimer's and dementia are a disease of accelerated brain shrinkage. So to give you an example, if I'm in my 80s, my brain will shrink by less than 0.5%, but nobody will notice. I won't score worse on a cognitive function test. If I've got mild cognitive impairment, it's going to be shrinking about 1%. And if I've got Alzheimer's, 2.5%. So I'd love to tell you a little bit about what happened with the combination of B vitamins and omega-3, because the brain shrinkage was actually 73% less. And in this recent drug, the brain shrinkage between placebo and anti-amyloid injected group, the whole brain shrinkage was 20% increased rate of brain shrinkage, right? So, do the drugs work? Very questionable. Are there downsides? Massive. Is it ethical to even be putting people on these trials when you know that there's risk of death and so on? I don't think it is ethical. I certainly wouldn't recommend it to somebody else. And then there's the old argument, which, sort of bashed around with COVID, is there anything else?
Yeah.
So I'd love to tell you a little bit about what's happened with the combination of omega-3 and B vitamins, because that's a direct comparison.
Yeah.
Tell you a little bit about
Please
that?
do. Please do.
Basically, my friend, Professor, I'll tell you, also unpack the story a little bit. Back in the 2000s, a friend of mine, Dr. Jim Brawley, who's a brilliant researcher investigator, arrived in London. We had a book on allergies and we were doing some promotion of it. And he had a suitcase. We had 2 suitcases. I said, that's a bit heavy for, a 3-day trip. He said, one's got my clothes in it. The other's full of research on homocysteine. And I said, can I read it? He said, yes. So I actually stayed up all night and read a suitcase worth of research on homocysteine. And this was, I think, in 1999, and then wrote a book called The H Factor, saying probably the biggest medical breakthrough of the century. And we can maybe unpack that a little bit. And a little while later, I was giving a talk, and at the talk was this professor from Oxford University. He was the second in charge at the medical school and professor of pharmacology, and also the woman who really discovered homocysteine, Professor Helga Refsum from Oslo. So I was a bit nervous, but they said everything Patrick says is true, and we became good friends. And in 2010, he did a study, because you find very high homocysteine predicts Alzheimer's risk. So we absolutely know if your homocysteine is going up, your memory is going down. If your homocysteine is going down, your memory is going up. If you give people B12 and folate, the homocysteine comes down, their memory improves. If they're lacking B12, folate, homocysteine goes up, their memory gets worse. And you find it in the brain. So we've got mechanisms by which homocysteine actually causes damaging things in the brain. So he designed a study, randomized placebo-controlled trial with a couple of hundred people with early stage dementia, pre-dementia, giving one group high dose B vitamins and one group placebo. And what happened was the ones on the B vitamins did substantially better on the clinical dementia rating, so much so that 30% at the end of the 1 year no longer had any score on it. So that's very, very important. What percentage of people do you have who are no longer scoring on the thing that you would use to diagnose the condition? In other words, 30% would no longer be diagnosed with dementia or cognitive dysfunction. And they got 52% less whole brain shrinkage, which is, you can see it, And then when they look closely at the Alzheimer's area of the brain, they got 9 times less shrinkage in 1 year on the B vitamins versus placebo. So it's a little bit like, how large a trial do you need to know if insulin works? And the answer is you only need 1 person. If you've got a diabetic and you inject them with insulin, suddenly they improve, you know that it does something. And when you're looking at brain scans, where one is, one group have shrunk by 9 times more in the Alzheimer's areas than the other, you don't, it's really proven, end of story. But then what happened is that brain cells, or the membrane of brain cells, so your brain is 60% fat, and the membrane, the sort of skin of the brain cell, is not only waterproof, but it has these blobby things called phospholipids, which come from eggs and fish. You might have heard of phosphatidylcholine, for example. If you go to a health food store and buy lecithin, it's phosphatidylcholine. And it has to attach to a stringy, zigzaggy thing, which is omega-3 DHA. So if, for example, you buy fish oil, you'll see EPA and DHA. DHA, docosahexaenoic acid. And the two have to bind. And that binding, if you like, that attachment, which is then called phosphorylated DHA, is done by methylation, which depends on B vitamins. So realizing this, they didn't give omega-3 because their study was just B vitamins versus placebo. But they went back to the beginning of the trial and they looked at the blood level of omega-3. And they split the participants into thirds, third highest omega-3, third lowest omega-3. And then what they found was the third highest omega-3 had not the 52% less brain shrinkage, but the third with the highest omega-3 DHA had 73% less brain shrinkage, which brought the shrinkage down below the level that you see in people with no cognitive dysfunction. And virtually all of them had no further memory loss. And then just quickly, and this is very important, the group with the lowest omega-3 had no benefit. So the B vitamins do not work without omega-3. So then a very important study in Sweden, which had given 2.3 grams of omega-3 fish oil, which is a very decent dose. That's like, 2 big fish oil capsules. An equivalent to eating, a serving of oily fish or more a day, had found really no effect. They went back to their blood samples. They didn't give B vitamins, but they looked at the homocysteine level. And they found the third with the highest homocysteine, in other words, lacking B vitamins, had no effect at all from omega-3, but the third with the lowest homocysteine, below 11, which is the cutoff point, i.e. better B vitamin status, had a massive improvement from the omega-3. And when I was telling you before that the clinical dementia rating of the drugs has barely hit half a point on 18-point scale, this was well over 3 times that effect. And then a very big study on B vitamins, which had a mild effect, thought maybe it's the omega-3 status. They went back to their results, same thing. They found the third with the highest omega-3 had a massive benefit from the B vitamins. So if without going into, various shortcomings in trials, you were to line up all the trials on B vitamins and dementia, you'd say some work, some don't. And if you lined up all the trials on omega-3, you'd say some work, but some don't. But if you line up the trials that have given one or the other and considered, the status of B vitamin or omega-3, so thought combined trials, if you like, every single one has worked. And every single one has worked way more effective than any drug, has reduced brain shrinkage when measured, way more effective than any drug, which is actually increasing brain shrinkage. And when you look at safety profile, only benefits. And then when you look at costs, and this is very important, it may cost you £100 a year to take the B vitamins and have a bit more omega-3. This latest drug is touted at $26,000 a year. And then on top of that, because of all this brain swelling and bleeding, you're going to have brain scans with each treatment, just to check that this is not occurring. Last trial, 3 deaths, 1,500 people, so 1 in 500. These are not, these were deaths that they attributed to the drug, with a benefit, that is really, really marginal. So it's a very weird situation. I mean, I know, and I think you know, that if there's a trial on vitamin C or vitamin D and one person died, it'd probably be taken off the market.
Yeah.
And here we are, with the deaths recorded in the papers, not generally being reported, but not hidden, they are there. And we're going, wowee, fantastic. Let's liberate NHS funds. Let's line up MRI scans. Let's gear up, because these drugs are not yet available in the UK. But the goal is to get them to be so in the next few years.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. And that's fantastic information to have. As someone who's now really thinking about this, I still have considered myself a relatively young person, but having this conversation, I want to do what I can to prevent anything further happening. So how can a person test their cognitive function
Yeah.
and find out what's driving their future risk?
Okay, so step one is years ago. I mean, when Professor David Smith's first study was about to come out, we were waiting for to break the code where you say we know who's on placebo and who isn't. And then the results were amazing. I said, what next? As the second in charge of Oxford University Medical School, he said, I hope it will be standard NHS treatment in 5 years. This is 2010. And I said, what would it be? And he said, well, first you have to, cognitive function declines 40 years before a diagnosis. So he said, we should test everyone over age 50 on a cognitive function test. If not good, measure the blood homocysteine. If above 11, give the B vitamins. I mean, you could say, why don't you give everyone the B vitamins? The answer is they don't need it. You don't need a lot of B12 unless you've got raised homocysteine. Why not test everyone for homocysteine? You certainly could do, like we test everyone for cholesterol. But really, step one, find out how their cognition is. So I was rather skeptical. I sort of thought, might take 10 years. Well, actually, we celebrate, well, I think it's the wrong word. We commiserated the 10th anniversary of this landmark research. And these are all published in the top journals in the world with no critique. No one has criticized any of the science because it's impeccable. So we commiserated the 10th anniversary with a podcast that I did with Professor David Smith, and absolutely nothing has happened. So anyway, back then in about 2013, I got permission from all the leading professors who had developed the best cognitive function test. There was a paper and pencil test that you would do if somebody was sent to a memory clinic. So, Mary's husband's not doing very well. They go to the doctor refers them to the memory clinic runs a cognitive function test. And you know how it is, it takes way too long to get to that stage. And then you wait, several months and maybe get a scan. And by then they say, yes, you've got Alzheimer's, and it's sort of too late. So I got permission to digitize it and make it freely available. We ran a clinical trial comparing the memory, the test done paper pencil with the digital version. It was absolutely perfect. And we launched it around 2014, 15, something like that. And we've tested over 400,000 people. So almost every day, 100 people do it. So anyone can go to foodforthebrain.org, click, take the test, do it. It's free. You do have to register, but that is also so we can collect your data anonymously, because what we're doing here is a lot of very profound research. And you also can't do it on your phone because some of these tests require a sort of tablet, iPad size or bigger, and you can't do it while you're watching the telly, listening to music, having a cup of tea, and the cat's running all over you. So, you need to have dedicated 15 minutes alone, computer. It's not a questionnaire. It's an interactive thing, and it's very, very accurate. And then when you finish that, you'll get a questionnaire. And the questionnaire, and this is, I'm chair of an amazing scientific advisory board we've got in the charity, and I can't believe how good. We have this team of world absolute top scientists, like the best guy in China. We've got 3 from the States. Doesn't really matter where they are, but basically, I find the leading professor, for example, we have one on ketones and brain fats and the aging brain, Professor Stephen Cunnane in Canada. Will you join us? Yes. Professor Robert Lustig, top guy on sugar. Will you join us? Yes. Professor David Smith, B vitamins, etc. And then an amazing study of 396 studies on Alzheimer's prevention, done by the Professor Jintai Yu at Fudan University Neurology Department in China, like one of the top guys there for sure. Beautiful piece of research. So will you join us? Yes. So basically all the top profs, they know that the only way to deal with this is prevention. And they know that this is the way forward. No one's paid, this is all voluntary. So together we started to explore what are the risk factors, how do we assess them, and how do we help people? And basically the questionnaire that you do, which is I think 110 10 questions or something, but it's very nice. It's very clean. Ask about your diet, your lifestyle, and various other things. Does not include, well, there's a couple, but it doesn't calculate from anything you cannot change. So in other words, when you do it, you get a percentage. And if it's 100%, it's called your dementia risk index. It means you're doing absolutely everything wrong that would increase your risk of developing dementia. And if you score 0%, you're doing absolutely everything right. And it then breaks down your score, and it's done on a traffic light system from red to green. And then it will break down, and there's this very nice sort of 8-cog thing. I probably have one here. This is our manifesto, Alzheimer's is Preventable. And actually, you know, you can all download this on our website, but it's literally the brain scans I was telling you about, you know, showing shrinkage. And then you'll get a cog, you know, that looks like this. So these are 8 factors, 8 domains. One is called low carbs and GL for glycemic load. One is brain fats. One is B vitamins. One is antioxidants. One is healthy gut. Then we have active mind, active body, and sleep and calm, which is also stress. And you'll score something like this. So it will show you your reds are your weakest areas and your greens are your strongest areas. And it will show you what your cognitive function, your actual test score is. So you now go, oh, that's kind of interesting. You know, there's room for improvement. And all of this is free. And then you have an option because, you know, we've spent $250,000 developing all this. And how do you raise the money and all the rest of it? So what we've built is an interactive, it's like an app. It's not actually an app yet. It may be program where you can sign up for what's called cognition. And it will cost you £5 a month for 6 months or £50 a year, which is also what it costs to be a friend of the charity. And amazingly, we've supported all of this work just by individuals going, I'll give 50 quid a year, you know, or £5 a month for 6 months. And then what happens is you're shown your 2 weakest links. So, you know, maybe it's active body and, you know, B vitamins, whatever it is. You're shown your 2 weakest links. You click on one and you then start to receive a series of emails educating you, showing you things to watch, to read, things to do. And then you get notifications on your phone, little reminders, you know, to keep you on track. And there are Zoom groups that you can join. And then at the end of the month, you go back and you rescore just that weakest link, just the questions there. And it shows you, well done, you've gone from red to maybe not green, but yellow, which is great. It then shows you your next 2 weakest ones and you pick one and so on and so on and so on. And we're trying to get you into the green. So an example of this is Alan, or otherwise known as Nodge. So basically in December last year, Dorothy and Alan went to the doctor for the results of the brain scans and said, you've got mixed dementia, which is Alzheimer's and vascular dementia. And the question was, what can we do about it? The answer was absolutely nothing. Join a dementia support group. So a bit pissed off, found our charity, Food for the Brain, did the test, found out exactly what to do. In his case, he was taking omega-3, but didn't realize about the B vitamins. And I should point out at this point, he couldn't find the loo at night in his own home. He couldn't both be eating a meal and talk. He couldn't even conceive of planting his garden. He was a gardener. He's a computer programmer. He actually struggled even to turn his computer on or off. And he started to do many things, getting a bit more sleep, having more social intellectual activity. He actually joined a Morris dancing group. He's Morris dancing. 3 months later, his cognitive function scores improved. He's planted his garden. He's back doing emails. He was also doing 5 days a month going ketogenic and having something called C8 oil, which helps to make ketones, which we might touch on. And, you know, that's what happened. Now, don't read too much into it because, you know, he's quite advanced and we'll see what happens. But, you know, it's not a bad thing. So the point is, here's somebody very advanced who can get some benefit. But what we want is younger people, you know, who may score fine on cognitive function. So the actual cognitive function is really good, but their dementia risk index it is not good, and it's a wake up. And as you and I know, these factors are driving everything, exercise, stress, sleep, eating well, and so on. So the knock-on effect of doing this, and I should explain here that briefly, I've written 46 books, one on cancer, one on arthritis, one on Alzheimer's, one on heart disease, and so on. So for me, the issue was, in a sense, we already know how to prevent a lot of diseases. The question is, how do you make a paradigm shift? I can train nutritionists, but they can only see a certain number of people. How do we shift? And I reached the conclusion a few years ago, to have a big impact, we've got to go digital health behavior change on an international platform. So I then thought, what should we focus on? And Alzheimer's is such a hot subject for a few reasons. Number one, it's terrible. It's why on earth, to watch people lose their mind completely. I didn't have anyone in my family at the time who had it. Now my father-in-law does. So, if you had to pick a disease to prevent, it would be a great one. Number two, you can't reverse it. You can reverse diabetes. You can reverse heart disease and so on. You can reverse cancer. It's harder, but you can do it. You can't reverse Alzheimer's once you've got holes in your brain. So it's got to be prevention. And it's become the number one fear. It's pretty much the biggest healthcare cost. So it's kind of, it ticks all the boxes, And one thing I like, but this is only because I'm a nutritional therapist. Back in the early days, Linus Pauling, a genius. So Einstein, when asked, "Are you a genius?" said, "If you want a genius, it's Linus Pauling." And Linus Pauling understood what Einstein was talking about and applied it to chemistry, and wrote a paper called The Nature of the Chemical Bond, how the electric ions attach and how things work. That's the beginning of modern chemistry. Nobel Prize #1. Like everyone knew ether made you unconscious. No one knew how. So he sat down and worked out the chemistry of unconsciousness. That's anesthetics for you. And then after Einstein died, they'd been campaigning against nuclear bomb testing. And on the day that the nuclear bomb treaty banning nuclear bomb testing was passed, Linus Pauling got a Nobel Prize, a Nobel Peace Prize. And meanwhile, he had 48 PhDs. And then it's quite a nice story to tie these characters together, but a man in Carmel, California, where Linus Pauling lives, had a son with schizophrenia, heard about Professor Abraham Hoffa, took his son to Canada. It was treated by Abraham Hoffa. The son got better. The father bought 50 copies of his book, took him back to Carmel, gave one to every doctor in the county. Linus Pauling was invited to tea by one of the doctors, picked up the book. Apparently, he was a bit antisocial in the Tea Party, just started reading it, took it home, and thus was born orthomolecular medicine, which is what functional medicine, optimum nutrition, I thought the word was too long, so I called it optimum nutrition, but the right molecules. And he got really focused on vitamin C. So we all know about vitamin C because of Linus Pauling. And this genius man, the first thing he did was he worked out all animals make it, with very few exceptions. Guinea pigs don't, bats don't, and primates don't. And so, when faced, for example, with a cold or a virus, he simply said, well, how much do animals make? That's the amount that we should take, which is about 1 gram an hour. All animals, body weight equivalent, he worked out that we need about 2 grams a day. 1 gram is 22 oranges. And he noticed that animals that don't make vitamin C have much more risk of viral diseases and much more risk of cancer. So some very simple, big concepts. So he spent the last 37 years of his life on vitamin C research at the highest level. So what I also like about Alzheimer's in this sort of, it sounds wrong to say like, but we know, I had a mother and a daughter at one of my lectures some years ago, and strokes are very strongly linked to raised homocysteine, and the mother had had a stroke. So the daughter said, must test your homocysteine. And the mother said, I will, if you will. The mother's level was 6. Remember, above 11 is brain shrinkage. So the mother was fine. Her stroke had nothing to do with homocysteine or B vitamins. The daughter's level was 26, which is really high. She had chronic fatigue. which she'd had ever since a car accident. And when she took the homocysteine-lowering vitamins, 30 days later, no chronic fatigue. So the point here is you've got something to test called homocysteine. And if it is raised, you don't need the RDA, which is the ridiculous dietary arbitrary, for B12, which is 2 microgram. You need about 500 microgram. So you need, over 200 times the RDA. So, the idea that you eat a well-balanced diet gives you everything you need, it's just, it isn't true. I got done by the Advertising Standards Agency years ago when I said that you have to take vitamin D in the winter. And they say, you're not allowed to say that because our rule says you cannot imply that you can't get all the nutrients you need from a well-balanced diet. And I showed them chapter and verse. It's not about the science, you just can't say it. So similarly, there are a lot of people who'd love to say, I live on a farm, I'm growing, beyond organic, regenerative, zero dig vegetables. Can you get all the nutrients you need from eating homegrown vegetables, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? The answer is no. We need B12, and it has to be from an animal source or synthesized. And if you're not absorbing it very well, which seems to be extremely common in older people, you need, hundreds of microgram, not just 2. So it's got this sort of extra thing in. And I think there lies the problem, because that B vitamin, that pill, that 5p a day supplement is a direct competitor with a drug. Yeah. The drug industry are not concerned about saying exercise more, eat a healthy diet, use your mind. They'll even fund a little bit of nice prevention talk. But when you've got, a pill, which in a randomized controlled trial has had much more effect than your drug. And by the way, it's about $1 billion have been invested in these drugs. Research. Sorry, I said $1 billion. No, it's the official figure. Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, the official figure. Yeah, it is $1 billion. So they need return. There's absolutely no question. And what we've got right now is just like cholesterol. I'll just tell you a real quick story. It doesn't matter if you get it all. Basically, cholesterol is normal stuff. We all have it. It gets damaged. You may know that if you've got diabetes, they measure your glycosylated hemoglobin, your damaged red blood cells, your HbA1c. Cholesterol gets damaged by sugar. It gets damaged by oxidants. And when it's damaged, it doesn't look right. And when it doesn't look right, it gets gobbled up by immune vacuum cleaner cells, like they would target a cancer cell, which become foam cells. And foam cells are what you find in atheromas and the blockages in the arteries. Homocysteine damages the arteries. So if you've got high homocysteine, you've got weak arteries. If you've got, let's say you smoke or have a lot of oxidants or you eat a lot of sugar, you've got damaged cholesterol, and you will get, these sort of cholesterol packages. It isn't cholesterol's fault. It's not amyloid's fault. So amyloid has never been shown to be a cause of Alzheimer's. But raised homocysteine is a cause. If it goes up, your memory gets worse. If it goes down, your memory gets better. And we know why and where. So we've got, we're at the birth. I will bet £1,000 within a few years, just like you'll get your cholesterol tested, you'll get your amyloid tested, right? Yeah. So the disease now is, it's like, I have the best cardiovascular statistics, but my cholesterol is whatever, 5.5 above the number. So they say to me, take statins. So in other words, there's nothing wrong with me. I have no cardiovascular disease, no risk. The disease has become high cholesterol because testing cholesterol is a feeder for the drug, and the disease will become high amyloid. That's what we are at the birth of right now.
Yeah. It's fascinating, Patrick. I could honestly listen to you for hours. I have got another question I'd like to go to, just because what we try and do at the PHA is apply lots of information from a number of different practitioners from various modalities. And it's very much, we want to look at preventative approaches, but also very much the individual's got to figure out and work with practitioners that work for them. But something we get back and forth, and I'm probably going to get shot by a number of nutritionists here, is what is the right diet for some people. So for some people, there's an advocacy for a plant-based sort of vegan diet, lots of raw food, etc. Whereas you've got other practices that say no, you shouldn't have the raw food, you should cook it. And then others obviously have a more carnivore or keto focused diet. What is your view? What is your feelings on this?
I'm not avoiding the question by running away. But let's say I'm sort of, vegan friendly. So personally, I didn't eat meat for 45 years. And for whatever reason, I'm a little now, maybe once a month, something like that. But I'm fine never eating meat. I was macrobiotic, I was vegan for reasons I'll explain. I then added fish. I have no dairy products. I eat eggs. I think they're good. On the farm, you've got chickens laying eggs, where's the harm in that sort of thing? So the reality is that a very high plant-based diet is a good thing to do. But if you are strictly vegan, you cannot get B12. And even though sometimes they've spoken about spirulina or chlorella having B12, it turns out to be non-functional B12. It's not the same as real stuff. So I was even I read a book, Optimal Nutrition for Vegans, because if someone chooses to be vegan, I want them to be healthy. And, we've had a dozen infant deaths on parents bringing their children up vegan. One happened from a health store owner. The mother didn't realize that she herself was B12 deficient, and consequently the baby was B12 deficient and didn't survive. So I got told off by the Vegan Society saying there's a little bit in shiitake mushroom, it looks like, and there's a little bit in some seaweeds, some of which may actually be contamination. So I know a study in India found that Indian vegans didn't seem to have so much pernicious anemia, which is B12 deficiency, as Westerns, European vegans. And the answer was why. The question was why, and the answer was there are a few weevils, mixed up in the lentils and the rice. So just a few insects, should do it. So you can't do total plant-based without supplementing B12. Omega-3, I think is very important. I want to talk about that. And I mentioned phospholipids, choline, eggs, fish, and so on. You won't get enough of that either. You can get lecithin granules, which give you more, phospholipids. Vitamin D, I think we all have a problem with, whether plant-based or not. So I've just done this a whole round of conferences. And I remember, and in many of them, they've had these debates. It's like the thing, plant-based or meat. And they're usually carnivores, never fishivores. I go, why are they never fishivores? And so I was sitting there with this former American Army medic, surgeon fellow, Sean Baker. He only eats meat, right?
Yes. Yeah, this is the thing. Big carnivore push at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I said to him, I sort of cut to the chase, but I said, so why are there no super bright carnivores? And, tigers and lions, have still relatively small brains. Our brain is 3 times the size of other primates. So 6.5 million years ago, we split from gorillas, chimpanzees, and bonobos. And our brain size gets bigger and bigger and bigger, up to about 1.5 kilogram, 10,000 years ago. And by the way, it's been shrinking ever since. So our brain size has shrunk by 10% the last 10,000 years to 1.35 kilogram. And there's a book coming out, I think, next week called The Shrinking Brain, exactly about this. But then, so anyway, I said, why are there no, sort of really super bright carnivores? And he said, well, what about whales and dolphins? So it's exactly my point. So from where I mean, this may be new to some of you, so excuse me for diving straight in there. I can, maybe I'll tell you the first bit of the story, then you'll get it. Basically, a billion or so years ago, some tiny little organism in the ocean incorporates a fat, a lipid, which is DHA, docosahexaenoic acid. It's 6 double bonds in a horseshoe. And it is able to convert solar energy, solar photon, into nerve twitch. So it's a twitch towards food. That's the beginning. When you say what's the origin of the brain, obviously it's in the ocean because, we all came from the ocean. That's the beginning of nervous system and brain, DHA. So this was discovered by a genius man called Professor Michael Crawford, who's a zoologist, and he had looked at the types of fats in animals' organs all around the world, and he found it depended on what they ate, except for the brain and the eye. The brain and the eye is always DHA. It's all about DHA. You cannot have a brain, you cannot have an eye without DHA, as simple as that. So it started to become pretty clear that there is no way that we could have developed 3 times the size of brain, compared to gorillas and chimpanzees, unless something extraordinary had happened to our food supply, because, we're only, 1.2% genetically different. We got the same genes, so it had to be the environment. And thus was sort of emerged the Homo aquaticus, or the waterside ape theory, that actually our distant ancestors exploited wetlands and swamplands, started to stand up, through wading in water. We've got the insulating layer of fat, which for many of us has become a little bit large. We got a nose and we've got hair and we've got a diving reflex. And then the real 2 clinchers of this whole idea that actually we evolved because we spent a lot of time in water and had a high marine food diet, which was picked up by David Attenborough. He said babies are born with a waxy waterproof layer, the vernix, which is what you wash off when a baby's born. He said, I have never seen that in a mammal, in a land-based mammal. He said this on telly. I wonder if it occurs in the marine mammals, who are, the last animals to leave the land and commit fully to the sea. I'm talking about dolphins, seals, sea lions, and so on. And some marine biologists in Canada picked up on this, and sure enough, seals, sea lions have identical waxy waterproof layer, the vernix. And then it was discovered that you've got these little sort of protrusions in the ear called extoses, and dolphins have completely blocked their ears, which is very good for diving. And by the way, a dolphin has every single bone that we have in our hands and arms in their flippers. So if you watch their fetal evolution, they have legs and arms and hands and all the rest of it, and then it sort of shrinks. Which is sort of interesting. So what happens is dolphins have completely blocked their ears, very good for diving. So they had to learn a new way to talk, which is sonar. And if a person spends a lot of time in the water, these extoses protrude. So ear-nose throat specialists can look in a person's ear and say, you're a diver. And we have 2 tribes, the Moken and the Baju, who live in Indonesia, who spend 5 hours a day in the water, can hold their breath for 10 minutes. And it was sort of moving in that direction. So thus was born the concept of Homo aquaticus, etc. So, and then I think we become land-based 10,000 years ago. So we move into agriculture. So, before, obviously, we had to live along the water's edge. And then an example of this, last example was where I live in Wales, in the Gower Peninsula. They discover the oldest Homo sapiens remains called Paviland man. Well, originally they thought it was a woman, but it turned out to be a man because he had a lot of jewelry, shells and necklaces and bracelets, but all shells. And the usual story is they would have been out there hunting with spears, eating antelope, whatever, which of course is what the carnivores want us to, think. But actually, when they analyzed the bone, almost a quarter of their diet was seafood. And when you think that, and it's easy because those estuaries and rivers, there's full of seafood. So it's much easier to just scoop that stuff up, and eat it. Very, very highly nutritious. Probably not just that, also, land foods and fruits and veg and all the rest of it. So because I remember before Linus Pauling died in his sort of mid-90s, I was filming him on his last great breakthrough on something to do with lipoprotein A. And he looked me in the eye and said, Patrick, follow the logic. It's the logic that counts. Don't worry about the randomized controlled trials. They come later. So I have no other logical explanation for how we became to be, so bright. Sperm whales have a brain 6 times our size. They're very bright too, if we didn't have a big supply of omega-3. So I think that we're not born to be fully plant-based. And if you want to optimize your brain function, you need omega-3. So when I learned that, I switched. So I call myself a sort of fishitarian. or a smoked salmon vegan, or a pegan, a pescatarian vegan.
Brilliant.
And funny enough,
Fantastic.
the Vegan Society did a very good study of all studies on who lives the longest. And the conclusion was the pegans, the fish-eating, plant-based, live the longest. So I reckon that's where I'd put my money.
Okay, fantastic. Wonderful. I'm going to just put one more question in there, and I think then we'll move over to Q&A. I've seen, I think someone started dropping questions into the chat. So if you're comfortable and want to do that, please do. Sure. Or we'll ask you to raise your yellow hand. So one thing I wanted to speak to you, just get your thoughts on really, is obviously it's to do with the brain. So why are children's mental health issues, and I don't know if that's the right terminology because I'm not a practitioner, but such as autism and ADHD, etc., on the rise? Do we know, have we got a theory on that one?
Yeah, well, I mean, and we have, I think 1 in 6 children now are neurodivergent, and we've seen rates of autism, literally quadruple over the last, few years. So there's a major problem happening. And it's hard to know exactly why. I'm sure, obviously omega-3 is important. The B vitamins, we see raised homocysteine level in children with autism, for example. So, there are all those factors. And just to sort of, Professor Michael Holford found, he runs the Institute of Brain Chemistry at the Chelsea and Westminster campus in London, that when a pregnant woman does not have enough omega-3, they produce a type of oleic acid, which is like olive oil is an oleic acid, which is used as a filler or a padder to build their baby's brain. And by knowing that level of oleic acid in a young pregnant woman, early pregnant woman, you can basically say which children are going to have mental health defects. So the point is, some of this might be happening during pregnancy. We know that homocysteine also predicts tremendously the rate of miscarriage and pregnancy problems and so on. So there's that going on. I see that someone's asked about glyphosates, and I think they're very important. But I think really the concept here is anti-nutrients. I think it's a really nice term developed by the late Professor Derek Price Smith, who got lead out of petrol. So we've got nutrition and we've got anti-nutrition, and an anti-nutrient is something that either stops you absorbing a nutrient, interferes with the action of nutrients, or promotes the excretion of nutrients. So an example of this is in the early days when orange squash was filled with tartrazine. My colleague at University of Surrey did studies where we'd give children orange juice with or without tartrazine, and they became more hyperactive on the tartrazine, but they excreted more zinc. So, glyphosate's a terrible thing. I don't think we should have it. Do we yet know if it causes dementia, Alzheimer's? No, not really. And we don't know. And also, I should point out here, there are a lot of things like, aluminium, for example, which we get a lot of in vaccines, is definitely not good for the brain. Does it cause the Alzheimer's process? I don't think so. So there are things that can mess up your cognition, heavy metals and so on, but they may not be driving Alzheimer's, which very specifically is a large part of this, problem. And then my own personal view, is we have to consider vaccines. We just have to. And, in the States, particularly where we're seeing a lot of these, of course, we're not allowed to mention these things, but I think a child has to have whatever it is, 45 vaccine doses in order to go to school. And vaccines usually have to have an aggravant. That is an agent that stimulates the immune system to react. And we know there was a problem with mercury and thimerosal and MMR and all that sort of stuff. And now a lot of these vaccines use aluminium, which you do not want to have in your bloodstream or your brain. And no one, has really looked at the combined effect thereof. And unfortunately, and I hate this, from the point of view of science, is you're not even allowed to mention it, So anyone who's worked in special needs, as I have, will absolutely have met, dozens of parents of autistic children who, when you say, what do you think? They say, well, I know. They developed the problem immediately after the MMR vaccine. And, we've had court payouts for that. So the idea that it never happens, it's just not true. I was sitting in the House of Lords a while back for some debate or meeting about opioid addiction with Chris Van Tulken, who's written a very good book on ultra-processed foods. And I think he said to me, are you whatever it is, a vaccine denier, And I said, are you a vaccine damage denier? So we've got to do the science on it. So it's possible. Is that having an effect on Alzheimer's? I don't think so. But in children, we have to look at that because they are getting exposed to things that were not there before. And then, of course, as a psychologist, there's social issues and the psychological issues, and lockdown's been terrible for a lot of children, and there's a hell of a lot with panic attacks, anxiety, and socialization problems, and so on. And then we have to look at the digital, effect, because we know that, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, and all that, they're all designed to trigger the reward system of the brain, the dopamine system, to give you a like, but you've got a friend. So it's like, how many friends have I got, and so on. So, which is creating all this sort of, social unease, and basically sending the brain into a sort of addictive cycle. So I think the combination of sugar and ultra-processed foods, lack of omega-3, maybe not enough, B vitamins, plus all this, social digital pressure, maybe, vaccines as well. It could be a perfect storm,
Yeah, no, absolutely, Patrick. Thank you, and felt eloquently put. I'm going to attempt to read this question, Patrick, but it may not make sense with me doing it. Do you advise people with dementia coming off rivastigmine?
Yeah.
Am I pronouncing that incorrectly? My sister-in-law is on 9.5 milligram patch. Doctor wants to increase. I don't believe it's of any benefit. This has over 320 interactions with other drugs. And about 2 food. I've just successfully taken off memantine 20 milligrams. Does that, I'm hoping that means something to you.
It's well, it's like that, basically these drugs really, don't work very well at all. And they're actually working on, they're what we call cholinesterase inhibitors. So when I was talking about the phospholipids, like phosphatidylcholine, which you get in fish and eggs, or if you're lesser than granules, actually it's quite a good story to lead into the next bit. When you talk about the phospholipids binding to DHA to make the membrane, what these are helping to stop the breaking down of the choline. So I think I would put this into the category of, here you are doing a combination of the wrong things, which may be eating too much sugar, not having omega-3, B vitamins, and so on. And your brain cells are starting to die. And some that are still functioning but not very well may be able to be kept alive a bit longer by one of these drugs. But the results are not particularly impressive. And one of the most sort of the big ones now, I think, off patent. So once the drug's off patent, there's no money to be made, so it gets ditched. Aricept would improve someone for about 2 years, but at the end of 2 years, they're the same as if they never took the drug. So in other words, they're not actually affecting the disease process, but they're just managing to keep something alive. So it won't make a lot of difference, is really the answer. But doing the test and finding out what's going on, that can make a lot of difference. But I'm sort of glad you asked that, because what happens is, and it's kind of easy to explain and sort of weird to get, is that brain cells can only run on 5-star fuel, either glucose or ketones, which I will explain. And what happens is, as you get insulin resistance, so normally glucose is taken through insulin receptors like docking ports, docking ports. Insulin carries the glucose into cells. And once you start to get resistant to the effects of insulin, which is what diabetes is, insulin resistance, you can no longer get the glucose into your brain. So even though you got there by eating too much sugar, you've actually got sugar deprivation in the brain cells. They can't get the glucose through. So as a consequence, those brain cells start to get really tired and you can't concentrate. So you have really an energy deficiency. Now, the other fuel that brain cells can use are called ketones. They're not fat, they're not protein, they're not carbohydrate. They are ketones. They're made in the liver from fat. So if you fast, for example, your body will start to break down your body fat, make ketones in the liver, and actually your brain loves ketones. It's probably slightly more than glucose. So, by the way, at our charity, we're often doing webinars, and we just did one with the genius Professor Stephen Cunnane, who takes older people with cognitive deficit, gives them every day 2 tablespoons of what's called a medium chain triglyceride. Let me just break that down. Fats are chains of carbon. If they're very short, as you get in ghee or goat cheese, is 3 carbons. If they're very long, like olive oil, it's 14. In the middle they're only in pairs, C6, C8, C10, C12. And he gave C8 and C10 oil. So in other words, there's a subfraction. And we've learned actually it's C8 only, pretty much. It's C8. So what I've been doing is taking coconut oil, which is C6, C10, C8, C12, extracting just the C8 until I've got 99.8% C8 oil. Tastes totally neutral, tiny hint of coconut. And he was giving 2 tablespoons a day, and people's brain cells, came back to life. So he reported 230% increase in brain energy from ketones, and the cognition improved. So that's sort of a little bit like those drugs. What they're trying to do is manage a situation that's getting worse, perhaps to do with homocysteine or omega-3s, whatever. But in this case, what we have learned, and this is what Nodge was doing as well, was that if someone's got to that point where they got an energy gap, probably because they have a blood sugar problem originally, and you give them an additional C8 oil, which you can buy in the health food store. My one's called Keto Fast, but you give them 2 tablespoons. It's literally a fuel for the brain. Whether or not it's going to help somebody who has no energy deficit in the brain, no blood sugar problems, is questionable. But if you've got someone who's starting to lose their brain energy, it's another way to go. And I would suspect that's going to be a lot more effective than these drugs. Cheaper, so on. Yeah. One slight caution is that if you take a lot of it too quickly, you can get some stomach cramps and possibly a little bit of loose bowel. So it's sort of introduce it gradually, find out what you can. It's better mixed in food. You don't have to, but for me, it's fine. But, some people get a little bit of gastrointestinal sort of effects.
Okay. Fantastic.
Amazing.
Fantastic. No, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, brilliant. Thank you so much. Patricia's got a question. You mentioned antioxidants. Have you looked at increasing our body's production of glutathione via activating a specific nuclear erythroid
pathway in our cells and been shown to regulate about 60 Alzheimer's genes? No, yes, no, sort of. If you look at the section, by the way, if you go to our website, foodforthebrain.org, and there's a section called For You, and in there it says Alzheimer's prevention, you'll find all the really good articles. And our professor on sort of antioxidants, polyphenols, is Professor Jeremy Spencer at Reading University. So you're absolutely right. Glutathione is, the king of all antioxidants. It's made from N-acetylcysteine, which you can supplement. It is actually recycled by anthocyanidins, which is the cyan, the blue-red berries. So you'll get a lot more if you supplement glutathione, which I do actually every day, or N-acetylcysteine, its precursor, either, and you're eating blue, red berries and so on. It really helps the thing work. So I haven't looked at it specifically in relation to, the regulation of all these, so-called Alzheimer's genes, but why not? And I think yeah, I mean, if we take one of those genes like ApoE4, I know you were asked me earlier about that. This is why I just there are things that alter our genetic expression all the time. Vitamin D is fantastic. So everything we're doing, blood sugar, homocysteine, I mean, basically what causes the gene expression is methylation. So I think everything, more antioxidants, more glutathione, everything is going to be altering the expression of our genes. Now, ApoE4, ApoE is a gene that is linked to Alzheimer's. And if you have a variation of it called ApoE4, then you've got a 4 to 6% increased risk of Alzheimer's. But what I realized was that all the big studies that have changed diet or given B vitamins or omega-3 or whatever, when they look at their participants, male, female, diabetic, not obese, et cetera, they always look at ApoE4. So I went back to the big studies, and there was a very big one on 200,000 people in the British Medical Journal, which had found that having a good diet versus a crap diet reduced your risk by 11 times. But the question was the benefit of the intervention of diet or supplements, whatever, more or less in those with ApoE4? And the answer is, it didn't make any difference. So we know that things like ApoE4 are affected by, the glycemic load of your diet, by vitamin D, by, all the things I'm talking about, really. So where I've got to realize is these non-causative genes, so we'll say predictive genes, are like a weak light. And when you shine the strong light of improving your diet and lifestyle, you can't see the effect of it. That's the point. So yeah, there are a whole lot of genes that you could predict that somebody with these genes will have a greater risk. But the minute you're doing the prevention stuff, it's completely irrelevant. Yeah. That's the sort of
positive.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're much less, we can manipulate our genetic expression. That's the point. And, if we take the BRCA gene for breast cancer, I mean, soya actually downregulates the BRCA gene. It's clearly shown. And dairy products really crank it up. So whenever you have something where half of people with this gene get a disease, the question you have to ask is, what's the half that don't get the disease doing? Because all genes exert their effect across biology. So yeah, I think glutathione is fabulous stuff. Fantastic. And I want to say also in the context of this, because I don't think that we just eat fish. We were always eating organic, we were always eating fresh, and I have two friends. Well, one of them's died now, but these were anthropologists who had the largest collection of ancient human feces. And I said, well, what were we eating? And the answer is a whole mixture. You'd find nuts and seeds and berries and this and that. A whole lot of stuff. Mixed bag. And yeah, I'm sure there are some parts of the world where there's an ice age and there's not a lot of food around. The best thing to do is to, eat a mammoth, So, we've survived in different ways, but the question is what's optimal. But the point here is when I'm asked, why do we need to take supplements? I say it's very, very simple. We don't eat enough. Yeah. We just do not eat enough food. So even workers in the Victorian age were getting a level of micronutrients, vitamins, minerals, essential fats that we cannot achieve today, even eating a really brilliant diet, because we don't eat enough. They had to chop the wood, fetch the water. There were no cars. There's no Ocado. There's no fridges. There's no stored food. All food had to be fresh. So going back to the Gower Peninsula, where a quarter of the person's diet was seafood. Well, let's assume they were expending 2 to 3 times the calories that we were to even get to the level that our ancestors were consuming of DHA and choline and B12, which these are very rich in seafood, by the way, we would have to have half our entire diet of seafood, right? So for that reason, we need to supplement. And if you are vegan, supplement vegan DHA. But I would strongly recommend all vegans to look at their omega-3 DHA intake.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Thank you, Patrick. We've got a couple of questions here left, guys. So we'll run through. I'm just conscious of time. So we'll run through these. Debbie says, can one take coconut oil as it is? It is a medium chain triglyceride. What is the benefit of the version you have developed? Thank you.
Well, coconut oil does contain medium chain triglycerides. And now that we know that it's principally C8 that does the ketone making, it's only 7% C8. So 1 tablespoon of C8, would have more bang than 10 tablespoons of coconut oil. And of course, by the time you're doing that, it's a lot of calories as well. So I do use coconut oils in foods, and I generally don't fry, but sometimes if I do, I use a bit of coconut oil. So I use coconut oil quite liberally, but C8 is a much bigger effect. And, we didn't know that. So the early trials on coconut oil kind of opened us up to the idea of the medium chain triglycerides. Now we know it is principally C8. So like Professor Stephen Cunnane, when he gave C8 and C10, C10 also works, but not so well. He says, next time I'd just give C8. That's what we've learned in the last few years.
Fantastic. Thank you. And finally, this may or may not be your thing. Have you any info on how the RNA jabs affect the brain? I know several people who seem to have cognizant problems after the booster. Is this something you've come across at all, Patrick, or not?
It's definitely something I've come across. So there's no question people have reported that. How that is happening, I don't know. So this is the kind of knock-on effects, thereof. And it's entirely possible. But I think it's also true that some people have reported, cognitive problems after COVID as well. And what sort of upset me during that time was that I knew people like Professor David Grimes would focus on vitamin D. It was so obvious. But nobody was paying attention to vitamin C. So we set up vitamin C for COVID and got a group of 1,000 doctors and professors and frontline workers focusing on vitamin C for COVID and published papers on it. Because basically, in case you don't know, if you ever get a cold or flu or COVID or anything, I take 3 grams of vitamin C straight away and then 1 gram an hour. And all I'm doing is what every animal does that makes vitamin C. And it's very, very rare that you'll be suffering 24 hours later. So, how much vitamin C you take on a daily basis, whatever. I take 2 grams, but, whatever. But that won't stop you getting, for example, COVID. I had COVID, it took me 18 hours, it was fairly unpleasant, but not too bad. So, you need more. So my doctor friends who had to have the jab because they're working in care homes and so on, loaded up on vitamin C, loaded up on vitamin D, took a junior aspirin, for a few days, had the jab, because it produces, this sort of micro clots. So it's entirely sort of almost expected that some people will get micro clots in the brain. If they occur in the heart, you might get myopathy, cardiomyopathy. They can occur in all sorts of places. So it would be very strange if there weren't some people getting after effects, in the brain. So the reason I say that is then, break down the clots. So what? I'll give you an example. I had a lady. I do a retreat once a year in our retreat center in the Black Mountains of Wales. And it's a 3-day retreat, and people can't call total health transformation. And this lady came, and she's sort of late 30s, and she had COVID, and something like, a month or two ago. And she's staying in a beautiful railway carriage we have on our property, which is up a little bit of a hill, 120 meters away. And she had to stop 3 times to get there. And, she said, I'm exhausted. And I've got less than 50% function, anything, you recommend. And she was already taking quite high dose vitamin C, so that was covered. So I said, yeah, vitamin D, in the winter, we should have 3,000 IUs. So you'll find a lot of supplements have 3,000 IUs. It stores. You don't have to take it daily. You could take it 7 times that dose once a week. So I gave her 7 straight away, just to maximize the vitamin D score. Then some of the most effective, and there are others as well, nutrients that break down clots, quercetin, which is what's in red onions, really, really good. Red onion will give you 20 milligrams. I want to give you 500 or 1,000 milligram. And bromelain, which is the protein digesting enzyme, so it actually breaks down clots very nicely, bromelain. And I kind of had a lucky break because some years ago, I formulated a supplement for people with allergies and inflammation and sinus problems and lung problems called Alex, which is quercetin, bromelain, MSM, and vitamin C. So, 3 good ones. So, it says take 2 a day or 3 a day or whatever. So I gave her 6. And the next morning, another 6. And the next day, so we're now talking 36 hours later, we went for a 1-hour hill walk in the Black Mountains with no fatigue. And she said, I've gone from under 50% function to probably 95% function in 36 hours, quercetin, bromelain, vitamin C, zinc, and sufficient vitamin D. So, there's other things you can do, but that seems to help people recover pretty quick.
Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Patrick, I could listen to you genuinely for hours and hours. You're one of the most fascinating people I've ever had the joy to speak to. I'd like to thank everyone else for coming this evening as well. Absolutely wonderful. Lots and lots of information. I'd love you to come back, Patrick. I think there's going to be a lot. We get most of our views online. So guys asking about the recording. Yes, this will go out on our usual channels over the next couple of days. Please do share it with others. I know there's a lot of other questions. So I'd like to arrange, and hopefully not too distant future, to get Patrick back here. So do come armed with your questions. And for those, please don't forget, go to foodforthebrain.org. I know we've got some practitioners, mostly practitioners on here tonight. Please do go and have a look at it. Please make your colleagues aware of it. Please speak to your patients and friends about it, because, prevention is key. And I just love the fact that we can get a bit of a heads up here and we know what we need to do. We can get guided in the right direction to deal with any potential issues. So, Patrick, once again, thank you so much this evening. Lots of thanks in the comments for you.
And can I just say one thing? We are hoping on the 1st of September or in September to launch an inexpensive home test kit to measure your homocysteine, your vitamin D, your omega-3, and your HbA1c, which is the blood sugar thing.
Fabulous.
So that's kind of coming. We need help. We need money, just to set these things up. Do become a friend of Food for the Brain if you can. £5 a month, or ideally £50 a year, because that is literally how we fund these things. We are the leanest, meanest charity. There's me and 3 others. We all theoretically work 2 days a week. We're all paid the same, and we just make it happen. So thank you for your support. Thank you.
Absolutely fantastic. Go get on the website, guys. Again, Patrick, everyone here, thank you so much for coming this evening. It's been absolutely wonderful, and we'll get the recording out in the next couple of days. And you've got a round of applause there, Patrick. Many thanks, everyone.
All right. All the